Welcome to the Herd on West Exec, the podcast that discusses everything you need to know about working in the executive branch of the federal government. Hello, I'm Irv Dennis. I'm a board member and CFO of the American Cornerstone Institute, and I served in the executive branch during the Trump administration as the CFO of HUD under Secretary Carson. This podcast is part of ACI's program called the Executive Branch of America, which is designed to educate what it's like to work in the executive branch. In today's topic, we're going to discuss what it's in the inner workings of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, specifically focused on the regulatory environment. And we're so fortunate today to be joined by Paul Compton. Paul was the former general counsel of HUD, and he and I worked together. We were sworn in at the same day, and it was such a pleasure to get to know him. He became a friend. And Paul, thanks so much for joining us today.
Irv, delighted to be here, and still consider you one of my great heroes.
Well, nice of you to say, but I know our listeners are going to get a lot out of this. Before we begin, maybe just spend a few minutes talking about your background and what brought you to HUD, and was the public service in your background, in your DNA? I know I came from a very different background than many that serve as a political appointee, but what's your background?
Yeah, mine was probably about as different as yours. Not that anyone would notice, but I am an Alabamian, so perhaps a little sound there, and have probably picked up a little bit more since I've been south of Potomac here for a few years. But my background was I was an attorney in private practice. I was with a large law firm that was based here in Birmingham, Alabama, but had offices across the Southeast from D.C. out to Texas. And, enjoyed what I was doing. As a baby lawyer, I started off as a bank acquisition lawyer. So I have a lot of good feelings from my friends on the accounting side. I worked very closely on those sorts of things. Learned all about contra assets even. Notwithstanding the fact my last accounting class was during the Reagan administration. But that really segued into working in affordable housing and the low-income housing tax credit. Was really just getting cranked up when I was a young lawyer, and a bank CFO told me, hey, we want to buy some of these things, go figure out how to do that. And that really started my career in affordable housing, which really spanned the next 20 plus years. And so my interaction with government was purely from the private side, and was pretty deep and broad across kind of the intersection of real estate, finance, securities, and tax.
Interesting. So how did you get the call of your interest of coming into the prior administration and working at HUD?
Yeah, it was really serendipity, Irv, in that respect. I should mention, when I was in college, I was awarded a Truman Scholarship, which is really aimed at public service. And so, I've long had an interest in public service, but, between career, family, and other things, really never found what I thought was the right opportunity to be involved. I'd been involved in an elective campaign right out of college, and knew that was not for me. after a year of doing that. But how it happened was a colleague at my law firm, Rob Couch, who you know well. Rob had been general counsel of HUD in the George W. Bush administration. He had also been president of Ginnie Mae. Rob is a dear friend and a great lawyer, clerk for Justice Powell. And I think is still well known around the HUD building. But he got a call asking if he would be interested, and he said, no, been there, done that. They said, do you know anybody? He said, well, yeah. Let me walk down the hall. And that's really kind of how it happened. The interview I had happened to be on a topic that I'd given a magazine interview for a now defunct magazine, The Weekly Standard, on an issue that was of some notoriety, and so I kind of clicked with, I guess, the White House counsel who was interviewing me, and one thing led to another. Next thing I know, I'm in a big black car going over to see Dr. Carson.
It's a once you get in that car, it's hard to get out. I know when I started, I know once I started the process, I was more intrigued than interested, and
Yeah,
I'm really glad I did it. And maybe we could talk
yeah,
about that a little bit later. But
yeah, yeah.
I
Same.
think once you realize the importance of the role and you don't, for me, I didn't necessarily understand how much I was going to enjoy it, but I got the sense this was a really important thing to
Yeah,
do, and I'm really glad I did it. But I will say, I found the confirmation process a little more daunting than I was expecting. Filling out the paperwork and going it through. How did you? Once you said yes, what were the next steps that you found, and how
yeah.
did you? How did you go about that?
Well, I guess the first thing was, when I said yes. I kind of thought I was closer to the end than the beginning, and I think I'm not even sure I was quite at the beginning. But yeah, as you said, or it's a very opaque process. It is hard. At least it was hard for me at every step of the way to have really any sense of what was actually going on. I found out that the president had nominated me because I'm sitting in an affordable housing conference, and my secretary starts blowing up my phone saying that she has been getting text and emails from people saying that it's been announced on the wire, but no one had called me.
How did you find the paperwork that you've had to fill out cumbersome or did,
Yeah, yeah, no, it certainly was. I mean, in some ways, for any of you who've taken a state bar, it's not terribly different from that. It's like list every place you've lived since you were 18 years old. Well, when you're 55, that can be a bunch of places. I'm glad I hadn't been a house hopper. So. Um, yeah, and it certainly is intrusive, and you get to tell every bad thing that's ever happened to you. From the time you were 18 or so, or in some cases the questions were after graduating from college. But the other part is that there's a team of FBI agents, and you give them, I think it is three or five names, I forget, and they go and talk to those three or five people, and they ask each of those three or five people for three or five names, and they go talk to those, and that goes on a couple of cycles until they've probably talked to about 40 people. And I'm not sure, Irv, you probably have at least 40 people who know you well and think well of you. I'm getting to the end of my list there. when you when you exclude family and coworkers.
well, I do some college guest lecturing, and I tell the young students that if you have aspirations to go into public service and do a Senate confirmed position, try to keep your nose clean from 18 on, just which is because they will find it. Your background was really well suited for HUD. Could you just maybe spend a few minutes for our listeners as to the mission of HUD and a little bit about the programs?
Yeah, and I guess in that regard, or I kind of I think it was Alan Simpson who said this, is that the highway of humility is never overcrowded in Washington, and I tried to take that to heart, but I probably had not enough humility, saying, hey, I know something about affordable housing. I actually know something about the securitization of mortgages. I've done manufactured housing finance. These are all things that are right within the core mission of HUD. And so I said, I'm going to know some of this stuff. Well, I spent 80% of my time doing personnel procurement and ethics, which I knew, and managing litigation, which I knew almost nothing about. And that along with giving interviews like this, which I didn't know much about either. So, but from my perspective, HUD is really a large financial institution. It's an intermediary. It doesn't, like a bank, banks don't build apartments. Banks don't, buy cars. Banks finance other people doing things like that. And that's what HUD does. HUD finances other people, whether it's buying their first home or whether it is financing a municipality to build some sidewalks. HUD's an intermediary. And so the things that kind of get the most public attention, I think, which would be um, fair housing and public housing, are really, in terms of inside the building. I mean, those are really two of the smaller program areas in terms of both HUD personnel and the funding that's associated with them. So that's what I came to learn is that HUD is much more like, whether you want to say it's a bank or an insurance company, and so it has a lot of processes that follow that.
They are certainly critical to affordable housing and lending. Affordability in the United States is an extremely important agency for sure that serves the public. As the general counsel, Paul, what were your primary responsibilities, and how would you? I will say one thing. One thing I learned: there's no typical day at all when you're inside the executive branch, because you wake up with an agenda and it could be all changed by 8:15 in the morning. But what would be your primary responsibilities, and maybe a semblance of a typical day?
Yeah, Irv, I don't know what your signal of the day is not going to go like you expected it to, but mine was usually when I walked in the office and the press secretary was sitting on my sofa. That was my signal.
So why would he be sitting on your office? Sitting in your office?
Well, usually she was holding a newspaper with some new article in it and saying, "How are we going to respond to this?" So that was If you recall in particular a set of dining room furniture, that was my first experience with that. But in terms of responsibilities, ironically, the general counsel at HUD is under the applicable regulations, responsible for all legal matters at HUD, other than appropriations. And ironically, you were in charge of the legal side of appropriations, and so. As I alluded to before, I mean, what I found, most of the time, if something kind of that was outside the charge that the secretary had given us about what he wanted to do, if something otherwise landed on my desk, it was probably not good news for somebody. It was a hot potato for one reason or another. But as I alluded to, dealing with labor and employment matters inside the agency were big, but also dealing with regulatory initiatives outside the building were a really big part. And then, as I mentioned, kind of managing litigation, whether it was either the actual or the threatened prosecution of actions out against our constituencies. I mean, for instance, the New York City Housing Authority, we had, a lot of, intense negotiation that was there with kind of the specter of litigation around that. And on the other hand, as you may recall from having a pretty big footnote on this, at one point the department had a $750 million contingent liability over a lawsuit. So that was really what took up most of the time. I mean, but there was a fair amount of, as I said, 97% of what I did was kind of not really red or blue in nature, but instead was just trying to make the trains run on time.
I found the regulatory process fascinating, and I wasn't nearly as close to it as you were. That was I know that you were very engaged in that. As it relates to the regulatory process, how are regulations established? How are they eliminated? I know one of the things that the administration was focused on is for every regulation that was passed, we had to deduct two. Can you explain the complexity of that process? Or maybe it wasn't that complex, but it seemed pretty complex from my standpoint.
Well, however complex you thought it was, Herb, it's worse.
Yeah.
Yeah. And first you kind of have to divide it up. I mean, um, there are regulations, and those are subject to the Administrative Procedures Act and have their own pitter patter. But then there are things that we would refer to as sub-regulatory guidance, and that would even extend to things such as the mortgagee handbook and credit underwriting for FHA loans, which didn't literally have to go into a regulation. And then there were simply guidance documents, which is, okay, here's how you're supposed to fill out this form. And every one of those has a bit of a different path of what's required, with true regulations kind of being at the top of the pyramid. And those, for example, would require pretty close interaction with a division of the Office of Management and Budget called OIRA, the Office of something in Regulatory Affairs. Where HUD couldn't, even with the Secretary's signature, couldn't just adopt a regulation. It had to go through a process that involved not only, I guess, constituencies inside HUD, but also other agencies. Frequently the Department of Justice would be involved. Other times the Department of Labor would be involved. The National Environmental Council might be involved. It's quite a process. And so starting a reg from start to finish, even if you're working really hard and making it a priority, is honestly a couple of year adventure. Something I didn't, appreciate at all when I started.
Yeah, as you go through that process and the coordination with the White House and OMB and the other interagencies, there has to be disagreements at different points in time. And how do you deal with those disagreements? And who's I assume the White House is the ultimate arbiter, but how does that process work?
Yeah, it is. It's pretty fluid, Herb, and it's fluid in the sense that, at a given point in time, you kind of know what the pecking order is. But over, as I mentioned, a 2-year process of a regulation, one of the things that you can find is that, staff change and views change, and, sometimes where you've started off marching to the Northwest and you find out somewhere in Montana you're supposed to be in Arizona.
It's I often talk about this with students, that what makes things hard in government to get done is you basically have 4 years. And, when you talk about a 2-year process, that would really mean that once you start your administration, you've got to hit the ground running pretty quickly. And if you wait till last year to do some of this, you may not accomplish if there's a change in administration. You basically want to have 4 to 8 years to accomplish. Was there things that you were really hoping would get done from a regulatory environment that you weren't able to? And you may not be able to give specifics, but what's that process like when you have to work away?
Much to my disappointment, I would say there were probably more things that didn't get done than I would say that we did, and certainly the current administration, pretty quickly undid a number of the things that we did do. I think looking, back at it, as you mentioned, you and I got sworn in the same day, so we were almost a year behind, because there's an extended process, and I think the Senate probably has now changed its rules and moves a little faster. But at the time you and I were going through, at least for a long time, a single senator could hold up, any nominee, and there were some senators who were, committed to holding up as many as they could. It's not really even 4 years. It was, 3. And so there certainly were. And I think in retrospect, um, I would say that, you know, you probably need to be a little bolder, but it's hard to be bold when, you're just getting your footing. I mean, it's a little bit like a cross country race, if when you're still running before dawn and don't quite know what the terrain is like, it's hard to go full speed ahead.
What would you say you enjoyed most about the experience?
I think what I enjoyed the most and this was something I think is perhaps particular to the Office of General Counsel. About half of the folks who I worked with were outside of Washington, and 10 regional offices and 30 odd field offices. And I've always appreciated seeing the results of what we do. I mean, you can shuffle around a lot of paper and wire funds around, but what's really nice is to see what gets accomplished for that. And when I would get to go out and I went everywhere from Anaktuvuk Pass, Alaska to the Keys of Florida. So it is a huge, diverse, rich country, one that just gives you a great deal of pride to be able to say you're an American after you had the opportunity to see that. But I enjoyed visiting with my people, the people who I worked with and who were actually getting things done. That was one of the things I enjoyed most.
When he, I found I really enjoyed the work much more than I thought I was going to. And I was in a different stage in my career. I was basically retired from my firm after 40 years, or nearly 40 years. I really did enjoy this. And one thing I really enjoyed was the stuff that was outside of work in Washington. You got to do some really neat stuff that I wasn't ever expecting. What kind of experience did you have with that? I know you flew on some pretty good planes.
Of course, one of the things my wife and I really enjoy walking, and DC is a great place to walk because it's a terrible place to drive. So, so we enjoyed our walks. In fact, I as you did, I think, unless the weather was really terrible, I walked to work every day and enjoyed that, and long walks, on the weekend. But there were some enjoyable things too. I got to go with the secretary and the vice president over to Detroit to a meeting. So I got my box of Air Force Two M&Ms. That was fun and interesting. And as you recall, we all got to go bowling at Camp David, which hit a couple of shots. I was talking to my golf pro the other day, and he says, "Well, what's probably the most interesting course you've ever played on?" I said, "Well, I played on one. I bet you haven't." And he said, "Well, where?" He says, "I played a lot of them." I said, "You ever played at Camp David?" And he says, "Well, no, I hadn't done that."
That's that was a fun experience, and that was a fun day. And you're right, they're the things that you get to tell your grandchildren about, and there's very unusual experiences. I actually found the networking out of the experience phenomenal, and everything I do now is as a result of my time in Washington. Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about the importance of the networking that can happen?
Yeah, it's just terrific because you do realize an incredibly big and diverse country it is, but at the same time, at least within kind of the area that you're active in, the people who are thought leaders and making things happen, it's a pretty small group, and so I enjoy that. I get calls from friends in Chicago or Washington State, or who I've met or interacted with, and it's good, and it kind of gets your creative juices flowing, because the way that something needs to be done in Central Florida is not the way that it needs to be done in New Mexico or, you know, Oregon. But it's interesting how you can kind of translate some of those ideas.
So, Paul, what are you? We have a few more minutes here. What are you doing now? What and when?
You know, Irv, I'm doing really exactly the same things I was doing before I came to Washington. I probably, you know, because of my Washington experience, probably have a little bit more of a regulatory overlay to what I'm doing. But, you know, I'm helping people finance and construct affordable housing for the most part. Yeah, I, I'm a real estate attorney, so you know, haven't drawn a mortgage since yesterday. So I enjoy that, and as I said earlier, you know, I like seeing things get done. And but one of the things we've done here in Alabama is I was part of an effort that we have a new state tax credit that is going to help support affordable housing, and particularly areas of Alabama. Unemployment in Alabama is thankfully very low. It's historically low. But one of the challenges that we have is that in rural areas there's plenty of housing that is relatively affordable, but in the places where the jobs are really booming, it is that housing is relatively speaking pretty expensive, and so you know we're trying to better address that by having housing that's targeted to workforce growth areas, such as in Huntsville, where you know a number of major manufacturers of the FBI is moving part of its back office there. So you know that's been very enjoyable. So I've been a little bit in the you know back in the governmental realm, and really enjoyed working with members of the Alabama legislature who frankly had never heard of low income housing tax credits until we started talking to, and it's kind of hard to get an elevator speech on that.
Well, it's thank you for continuing the mission. In many ways, you're you know, supporting it in the private sector to help those and on the lower level of the ladder. So thank you for that. As we wrap up, any encouraging thoughts for those that might be interested in a career or either part-time or full-time or a portion of their career in the executive branch?
Yeah, I think spending some time in the executive branch is really invaluable. I have long believed that you know you can't really complain about anything until you've you know done it yourself. So I can complain about everything now, Irv, but
Exactly.
I now am at a much smaller law firm, and I'm happy to say in you know 3.5 years I haven't been in a committee meeting yet. So had enough bureaucracy in 3 years to last me a lifetime.
I
But
always tell folks that there's you can learn an awful lot inside a government. In each agency, there's very little you can't learn. And when you think of HUD as an example, it touches all aspects of real estate from land development through the mortgage process, the equity flow or the liquidity flow, and the mortgage world. So it's you can learn a lot inside the executive branch at almost any agency.
no, and that's right. And more than that, it is. I mean, you know, the federal government is immense. I mean, HUD as agencies go is really pretty small, at least in terms of numbers of employees. You know, I mean, Department of Agriculture is 10 times as large in terms of employees, but you it certainly is big enough that you learn a lot about just how to manage a very large organization.
It's also helpful. I found it fascinating to learn how the budgetary process works, how grants are made, how the money flows from Treasury out to those that the mission serves. There's just a lot of learnings that you really can adopt out into the private sector. So, Paul, thank you very much. This was a
Yeah,
real
no, this
pleasure,
is
and
fun. Or
yeah,
appreciate what you're doing with ACI and you know supporting Dr. Carson. That's terrific.